For a long career in state government.
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it. That always interrupts me. Nothing like a pop-up talking to you. But we are so excited to have Pam. She has incredible experience in this area, whether we're talking about tax policy, budgeting, education, finance, workforce policy. She really has it all. Before her current position, she was with the State Justice Cabinet, where she focused on juvenile justice, policy development, budgeting, and strategic planning. She has a law degree from the University of Kentucky and a BS in business from St. Bonaventure in New York. And I can't think of anyone better to share this with us today. So from the entire What's Next East Kentucky Network, we're so happy to have you. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Pam.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me today. I'm going to start out by saying that a lot of my slides are really dense. There's a lot of material on them. Don't be nervous about that and don't feel like you have to take notes because you'll get a copy of the slides afterwards. This is a huge area to cover in about 20 minutes, which is about the amount of time I've had. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a pretty high level overview, just so you kind of know what the areas are and what kinds of things are possible. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm not going to talk about a lot of the stuff that ends up being on the slides just because there is so much, and I want to make sure that I leave time for questions at the end. So with that, so because this is What's Up Eastern Kentucky, what's up with ARPA local funds? How can they be used and how can you be involved? So I want to start with a little bit about how much money there is, how it came to be, and just so you kind of have a little bit of background. So Kentucky's cities and counties are all going to get money, and they've already gotten half of their money from the ARPA funds. And the distributions are based primarily on populations. And as was noted in the introduction, for a lot of local governments, the amount of money they are going to receive is huge. And in some cases, it actually rivals their annual budget. And I think you received a list of allocations by city and county before this presentation. And if not, we can make sure that you get them because that amount has all been determined. But to provide a little bit of context about how much money this is, the average amount that counties will receive is about 24% of their annual receipts from all sources, with a range of 7% to 64%. And if we look at just county tax revenues, the average amount is 52%, and 68 Kentucky counties, 68 out of Kentucky's 120 counties, are actually going to receive more in ARPA money than their entire year of tax collections. We don't have the data to provide information about cities, but just so you know, it's really a whole lot of money. And so in total, Kentucky's counties are going to receive about $868 million, and our cities will receive $931 million. So it's not unfair to say that this is really a pretty big deal and an unprecedented opportunity. So looking at how the funds can be spent, there was an interim rule that was issued in May of 2021. And it was an interesting interim rule because they asked specifically for comments. They had questions in the interim rule, which is really unusual in interim rules. Usually they just put it out there and then people can comment and say what they like and what they don't like. But they asked specific questions that they wanted state and local governments to respond to, and they got over 1,500 responses. And so since May of 2021, everyone has been following this interim rule, but in January of 2022, they came out with their final rule. So until then, and it's effective April 1st of 2022, but until then, governments can follow either one. And one of the things that happened with the interim rule is that the final rule is they really expanded the areas that communities can spend on. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. And so for the expenditure guidelines, when do they get the money? When do they have to spend it by? What happens if they don't spend it? They've all already gotten their first tranche of money. And the second one is going to come in between April and July of 2022. The counties and the bigger cities will get their allocations first, and then the smaller cities will get their allocations later. And by the way, Kentucky has 418 cities that are getting money. under ARPA. So they have until December 31st of 2024 to allocate the money. So that means they have to appropriate it, but then they have another couple of years to spend it. So it all has to be spent by December 31st of 2026. They can transfer sums to money to subrecipients. So what that means is if like you have a nonprofit in your community and you perform services that maybe the government would perform, they can contract with you to do that, and then you become a subrecipient. They can also do loans with the money, but there are some special rules for that. So now just getting into the big categories, there are 4. And within each of the categories, there are subcategories. So it's all pretty confusing. The rule itself is several hundred pages long, but there is guidance that's shorter. But those 4 areas are replacing lost public sector revenue, public health and economic response, providing premium pay to eligible workers, and then investing in water, sewer, and broadband. So I'm going to start with the first one. And this is the area really where the biggest change was made between the interim rule and the final rule. And that has to do with replacing local revenues. A lot of local governments said it was going to be really difficult for them to figure this out. So what they did is tried to determine the average on a nationwide basis of what lost revenues were due to COVID. And so they created a safe harbor of $10 million. And so local governments can spend up to $10 million of their allocation just on regular government expenses, the stuff they would normally do. Anything they would normally do is generally going to be okay. And so what does that mean for Kentucky? Well, pretty much all but 10 counties and 6 cities in Kentucky, their allocation is less than $10 million. So they will be able to spend their entire allocation on just regular government expenses if they want to. Those other counties and cities that are bigger will probably do the calculation that's in the rule in order to determine how much they could spend under this category. And I've listed some projects here because these are things that you might not normally think of. This is the only category that doesn't have to be directly related to COVID. So in other words, you don't have to identify a specific COVID-related expense and then have a solution that addresses that. There's just an assumption that up to $10 million is lost revenue, and that's because of COVID. So they can use the money to do road construction. They can use the money for schools and hospitals, health expenses, just their general government expenses, paying payroll, environmental remediation. They can buy fire trucks and police cars. And this is a really interesting one. Normally, if there's a federal program that requires a match, you can't use other federal funds to do that match. You have to use local funds. But other than Medicaid and K-CHIP, they can use this money to provide local match. So now moving into the second big area, which is responding to public health and the economic impacts of COVID. What I've listed over here on the left are the 6 broad areas within this. This is the second biggest area that local governments can spend money on. And in this case, and all the rest of the things I'm going to talk about, there's a 2-part way of thinking about it. One is that it does have to be directly related to a COVID-19 issue. And then the solution has to be designed to address that COVID-19 issue and has to be in proportion to that. So that's true from here on out. And so in responding to the public health emergency, you can see here, I've got a whole list of expenses that are permissible. And I'm not going to read all of these, but these are all the things that you would think of that would make sense in responding to the public health emergency relating directly to COVID. And again, remember, you'll have these slides afterwards, so you don't have to worry about taking notes on these. And then there are 2 other areas within this relating to medical expenses and behavioral health. And these categories allow expenditures both for individual families that live within the community. So if you have individual families that are experiencing some of these issues, the money can actually be used to help them. But then they can also be used for larger programs that help a lot of different families or individuals that live in the community. And then the next category, broad category here, is responding to violence. And everybody has heard that gun violence has increased during the pandemic. And so one of the permissible areas of expenditures are for communities to refer victims to trauma recovery services, to create community violence intervention programs, and to do some specific things to address gun violence. So this is one that you probably wouldn't have thought of necessarily as being a permissible expense, but it is. And then we move to individual households and generally speaking, how individual households can be helped. And so there are two categories. One is impacted and one is disproportionately impacted households. And there are income limits, households that experience unemployment, that have food or housing insecurity, that qualify for several of the federal programs. And so these, and one thing I wanted to note here is you can look and see that the income limitation is based on the federal poverty level or the median income of similarly sized households. Generally speaking, the federal poverty level is going to be higher. And so if you're thinking about a program that relates to this, that would be a better standard to use if you want to include more people. And as an example, at 300% of poverty for a family of 3, the level is $65,880. And I know I'm moving really fast, and I'm sorry about that. Hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions at the end. And so here are some examples of projects that can be provided for folks that fall within those categories, including food assistance, emergency housing, health insurance coverage, cash assistance, paid sick leave, childcare. You can see there's a whole range of things that local governments can do with their money to help people directly. Then the second category is disproportionately impacted households. Generally speaking, those are income households with lower income, or it could be a qualified census tract. That's kind of a HUD thing. They have these qualified census tracts. And so anybody living within that, and these are all presumed to be okay. So in other words, if the local government is doing projects within these areas, then they're presumed to be valid projects. And so then here are a list of some of the things that local governments can spend money on to address issues for folks that live in these kind of neighborhoods or have these education levels. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you can go back and look at these later. And so then the next big category included under this particular, the next big, I guess, subcategory under this category is help for small businesses and nonprofits. They're addressed separately in the rules, but the kind of assistance and the things that trigger the ability to provide the assistance are the same for both. So when you think about a small business, that's defined as fewer than 500 employees. And I know a lot of us probably don't think about that as a small business, but that's the federal definition. And then the nonprofits that are included are 501c3s or 501c19s. C19s are veterans organizations. And so for these organizations, if they have decreased revenues or lost receipts, financial insecurity, increased costs, lack of capacity to weather financial hardships or challenges covering their general business expenses, those are all conditions that would warrant local governments stepping in to support them. And the local governments can provide loans or grants or technical assistance or other sorts of ways to assist the business with business planning. And so there's also disproportionately impacted small businesses and nonprofits, and it's the same categories as households. Essentially, if they're in a qualified census tract, then additional things can be provided, including rehabilitation of commercial properties, technical assistance, business incubators, and also support for micro businesses, which are defined as having 5 or fewer employees. And the assistance that could be provided there include childcare and transportation costs. And so then the next thing is impacted industries. And for this category, industries related to travel, tourism, and hospitality are already identified and defined in the federal rule. So assistance for those industries is presumed to be fine. And then in your local area, if you have another industry or group of industries that was disproportionately impacted, there is a process for you to go ahead and identify those as well. And so some caveats here is the business has to have existed prior to the pandemic and had been affected by required closures or other mitigation measures. And the aid should be broadly available to all businesses within a category. In other words, you shouldn't just pick out one business and provide the aid, but you should make the aid available across all of the businesses. And Treasury recommends that first operational expenses be provided than other things. And so there are several different things that can be used to help these industries. And then I'm not going to linger long on this one. These are related specifically to the public sector and how these monies can be used to supplement the pay of first responders, people working in public health and human resources, and also how the money can be used to rehire people who have been furloughed or who may have received fewer hours during the pandemic. And it also allows hiring up to 7.5% more than the employees than were had beforehand. And of course, you have to be careful with these things because, as I noted, this is one-time money. So when it's one-time money, you want to be careful about spending the money for things that are going to continue beyond it. And then the last public sector category are things that can be money can be expended on in order to address effective service delivery. And this is the part where if a local government wants to hire a consultant to help figure out how to spend the money, or to look at programs to evaluate, or to gather data and analyze things to help improve technology, this is the category that those expenses can be made out of. And then the last the last public sector capacity expenditure area is capital expenditures. And so if the capital expenditure is less than $1 million, there is no written justification required, and pre-approval is not required for any capital expenditures. If the expenditure is over $1 million, written justification is required and information has to be submitted as part of regular reporting. And I've got here on the slide what the written justification includes. And so here are some examples of projects that they list in the rule that can be done with this money, and also a list of projects that are presumed to be ineligible. One of them is a new correctional facilities as a response to increases in crime. One is construction of new congregate facilities to decrease the spread of COVID. And then the other is, if you think about this in terms of like what would be economic development projects like convention centers, stadiums, or other large capital projects, those are things that are presumed to be ineligible. Now, that doesn't mean that local governments can't do it, but they have to jump through several more hoops to be able to do it. And so I mentioned that in all these categories, local governments have the ability to identify other things that they think would be an appropriate use for the funds, and then using them for that. So everything I've talked about are things that are enumerated in the rules where there is an assumption that the expenditures are okay if they are for these purposes in these categories. But local governments also have the ability to identify other things. They just still have to show that it was a COVID-19 public health or economic impact, and then they have to design a response that addresses that and that is proportional. So then the next category is premium pay. And this basically allows frontline workers to be given supplements or extra pay in exchange as recognition of the fact that they have worked more hours and put themselves at risk essentially to keep working. There's a whole host of areas that are included here. A whole bunch were added by the new rule, but you can see what all they are here. Pay can be flexibly awarded up to $13 an hour, and it can be in installments or lump sums. The maximum amount a person can receive under this is $25,000. You need special permission to provide this to people who make more than 150% of the average annual wage in the area. And so now moving on to the last few areas, we have water and sewer infrastructure. And I know that several of you had questions about this. Basically, if it's a project that would qualify under the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund or the EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, then it qualifies for use of this money. And then what I've got listed here on the slide with the check marks are other things that could be done that aren't under either of those programs, but would be an allowable expense under this category. And they are considered necessary expenses. And I've also got on this slide what the definition of necessary is. And then there is the broadband infrastructure. And this slide is really busy and it has a lot of information. And I'm not going to talk about it in great detail. As you probably know, the Commonwealth General Assembly has devoted quite a bit of money to broadband infrastructure. And this money is in addition to that as a permissible use for local governments and also for the state. And I'll let you go back and look at that if this is an area that particularly interests you, because like I said, it's a really busy slide. So now there were some questions about what can the funds not be used for. They can't be used for a reduction in net tax revenue resulting from a change in the law. So if you lose tax revenues because of things that happened because of COVID or other things, that's a different situation than if you explicitly cut your taxes. It can't be used to pay down pension obligations or reduce unfunded liabilities. They can't be used to pay for debt service or financing costs, can't be used to add to rainy day funds or settle obligations or settlements, and it can't be used in violation of laws or regulations. There are reporting requirements in the Act, and there have been some reports filed already. I know Lexington and Louisville both have reports out there. They have to put it on their website under the rules. But for most small cities and counties, their reporting is only going to be on an annual basis. And so this isn't going to be a great place for you to get information about what they're using the money on, because the reporting just isn't all that frequent. The larger counties and the bigger cities have to report more frequently. They have to do quarterly reports, but there's detailed information about all of this in the rule and in the explanation of the rule. And I forgot to mention that there is a document that explains the rule, and it does it very well by category. So that would be a base document that I would suggest that you go and look at. And so now we come to community engagement. What is it that you can do and what should you do? In its initial guidance, Treasury urged local governments to engage people who live in their communities, recognizing that this money could be a catalyst for great development in local areas and for, to do things that you haven't been able to do for a very long time and to make investments. But there are no requirements in the rules or the law that local governments do that. Because of the lack of final guidance and the length of time there has been to spend the money, a lot of local governments have delayed making their decisions about what to do with this money. And so the final rule provides a significant expansion, as I mentioned, from what the initial rule was in what money can be spent on. So the governing bodies in cities and counties are going to be responsible for budgeting this money. And so some questions you could ask right now are: how much money has been received and how has it been spent or allocated? How much more are you expecting to get, and what and how do you plan to engage the community in spending that money? How are you going to get feedback from the folks who live here? What processes do you have to hear about what people need? And have you thought about trying to find out what people need who aren't people who are generally going to reach out to you? So you guys, if you're on this call, you're all advocates and you're engaged and you're interested, but there are a lot of people in your communities who have needs and who have that these money could be used to help, but they're not the people who are going to be reaching out and just saying, we have this need. And so how is it that those folks are going to be heard in this whole process? There's a hot link here. And again, we can't do anything with that in a PowerPoint, but this is a piece that we wrote a little bit ago that has some resources about some communities and what they're doing to get community impact, feedback and all of that. And you could use that as a thing to look at and find out more about it. The other thing I want you to be aware of is that there are several other ARPA funding sources that help local communities in addition to this that you should be aware of. There's a capital projects fund, there's a homeowners assistance fund, there's an emergency rental assistance program, there's a state small business credit initiative, and information about all of this is available on the Treasury website. The Treasury website is really good. It answers any question that you could possibly think of in probably more detail than you would expect. And so I would highly recommend that to get more information that you go there. And last but not least, this is also a hot link on the slide, and this is the Treasury website link. So that's where you would go to get the information that you might need beyond what I've said. So again, I apologize for the breakneck pace at which I went through that, but it really is a lot of information. And I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has any for a few minutes.
I saw one come into the chat, Pam, and it says, can money be used for matching grants? During the flood, we have many private driveways that can't be repaired. I assume money can't be used for private driveways.
So this is a little bit of a tricky question, because if it would be an expenditure that a government could normally spend in their regular government expenditure, it could come under that $10 million. Otherwise, it has to be directly related to COVID. It can't be related to the flood.
Yeah, I had a quick question about the broadband. It might have been on the slide, but can it be used for something like setting up an advisory, like an advisory board in a community, as something as small as that?
Yeah, it could be used. It wouldn't probably be the broadband money that you'd use that for. It would be under the regular government expenditure, the $10 million, if it's an expenditure that the government could normally make.
Mhm.
Or if it's COVID related, it could also be under that second pot of money, which relates to, you know, setting up infrastructure and government administrative things to help think about what to do and how to do it. So I think there are two possible places that could be done.
Cool. Thank you.
And there, I see that there's, what about things like roof on the public library? And again, going back to the categories, if that is an expenditure that could normally be done by the government, it would be possible. Otherwise, capital construction, things like that have to be directly related to COVID, if that makes sense. So think about it this way, that $10 million, which most of the cities and counties can use for whatever would be a normal government expense, there's going to be very little restriction on the use of that money. Once you get into those other categories, everything else besides that, you're going to have to show that it was a COVID related impact, that it is a response that addresses that, and that it's proportional. So that applies to everything except for that first category.
If I may, who's going to be the final say so on how that money gets spent once it goes past the $10 million threshold that you were speaking about that any government should be able to get? There'll be additional funds there, and who will be the decider of who gets those funds and how those are spent?
Well, I want to back up for a minute and say that your local government may decide that they don't want to use the $10 million for just regular government expenses, that they would rather do some of these things that might not be appropriate for normal government expenses. And so I didn't mean to leave the impression that they're just going to take the $10 million and do that. That's an option for them, but they may choose not to, because they may want to do some of these other things instead that wouldn't be something that they normally would do as a government, like providing specific help to individual households or people that need it, things like that. So those decisions will be made by whatever the governing body is. If it's a county, it's going to be the fiscal court. If it's a city, it'll be however the city is arranged. It's going to be what is essentially the city legislature. So that's the body that you want to interact with that will make the final decisions about all of these on the local level. So the state doesn't really, the way that this all works too, I forgot to mention this, is the state doesn't have the ability to restrict or limit what local governments can do with this. The state could make recommendations if they wanted to, but it's going to be completely up to the local folks about how to spend this money.
Martina, would you like to share your question? And then I think we will introduce our second speaker.
Great, thank you. I guess I'm wondering specifically about, the community engagement piece can always be a tricky part. So as an advocate, we definitely hope the city of where I live does that. But when it comes to like the specifics of how the funding is allocated, are cities allowed to create sort of like pockets of like mini grant programs? Say, for example, how is it determined how many businesses are going to be funded, or how the arts programs may have suffered? How specific does the city have to be about, are they able to create, say, we want to put $500,000 in small grant programs? Is that an allowable expense then?
It is an allowable expense. And if you're looking specifically at COVID, let's use, for example, the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry. If they want to create a fund for grants for organizations within the community that were impacted by COVID, and establish an application process for that and then distribute it out. Remember, the overlaying thing there is it should be generally available. And that doesn't mean it has to be, because remember, they can always go and ask for anything special. Say they've got one theater in the town that they specifically want to benefit, and they don't want to make it open to everybody. They can do that, but it requires another steps. But if you wanted to do something that was generally responsive to impacts on an industry, you could do a program like that. Yeah, I mean, I think that and that's one of the reasons I think that a lot of local governments are getting consultants to help them with this, because it's a big amount of money and it's a lot to think about. And there are a whole range of things you can spend it on. And there are so many needs that it's going to be really hard to think about, of all of these things that need to be done and all of these people that need help and all of these areas that have been impacted by COVID. What is going to be the best way for us to make these investments so that we move our people and our communities forward into the future? So I think that being creative, as you're thinking about how you engage and the ways to do this, and thinking about what is going to help us both now and later, are really good ways to think about it, because these are not recurring monies. So you definitely don't want to use them or recommend that they be used for expenditures that are going to accrue, that you're going to have to make year after year after year, because they're not going to be here year after year after year. But it is an incredible opportunity to make investments in things that your local governments just really haven't had the money to do. Now they can. Does that help? Okay.
So,
All right.
Just one more question. So I guess I'm concerned, Pam, that our local county government will try to spend all the money on roads. Is that something that they could do possibly or not?
Yes, they can.
Okay, we need to get involved with the decision-making process.
Now, here's another thing, though. There was just a big infrastructure bill passed at the federal level, and there's going to be a lot more infrastructure money specifically for roads coming to Kentucky. So to the extent that, about that, all the local governments are going to get quite a bit more money under the program the way that it is. And there are also optional grant programs, especially for bridges and things like that in rural communities that have never existed before. So there are other possible resources. So one thing I would urge you to do is be aware of these other things that are available, and like those other programs that I mentioned to you, and other sources of funding for those things, because this money should be used for other things if you've got another way to do those other things. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Pam, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so much. I think what I've learned is that this is pretty complicated, and that there are going to be a lot of big decisions made at your local level. And today, our next speaker, I'm really pleased to introduce. We wanted to have a local perspective. So today, also with us is Lee County Judge Executive Chuck Caudill. Really a friend of the network. Chuck does amazing things in Lee County, and he has had to face these tough questions. So we've asked Chuck to just share a little bit from his perspective, how he's approached these funds and how he's dealing really with the pressures of the decisions around these. So without further ado, Chuck, feel free to unmute yourself and share your video, or not share your video, but turn your video on if you have one there.
I've got it on. Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Everything you said echoes pretty much everything I've been hearing all along. For me as a county judge, one of my biggest concerns early on was there were too many restrictions placed upon this money. And many of us in the KCJEA, the County Judge Executive Association, were reaching out to NACO and other areas saying, hey, listen, you guys give us some money and then tell us what we can and can't use it, make it so complex that it's difficult for us to figure out what was going on. The last determination really helped us out a lot. Ms. Thomas also made a very good point that and you trust me, your judge executive, I'm sure, is probably thinking just like I am, that there's a huge amount of infrastructure money coming down the pipe too. Especially for us in small counties that operate on shoestring budgets because we have such small populations. $1.485 million sure seemed like a lot of money when they sat there and said, here it comes. But the reality is it's not that much money. You start talking about roads and you start talking about bridges, that'll eat it up very quickly. Now, what I did early on, before we had the flexibility we have now as of the last determination of how we can spend the money, is I do a weekly column in the local papers. I ask the community to give me input on issues. I also have a Facebook page, which is the government Facebook page for Lee County, which routinely have discussions about how the money should be used. But like every other county, I have a fiscal court, which in my case has 4 other magistrates, and they have their pulse on what the community is saying. And so that's how I try to keep the community advised and informed of what we're doing. And if they watch our monthly fiscal court meeting or even our special fiscal court meetings, because we stream them all, they will know what the discussions are and how we're going with how to use the COVID money. What we've used it for so far is we took 150, the fiscal court agreed to give the city of Betable, which manages the water system here, $150,000. They came back, saying they needed 130. That's what we sub-granted to them. And right now it looks like they're not gonna need all that amount, so we're gonna get some of that money back. We gave all of the county workers premium pay. So that was, that translated to roughly another, I think probably, I'm trying to think about $350,000. So, we've already eaten into that money somewhat. What we plan for the future is we've got our own ambulance service, and we're going to use a lot of that money to try to cover first responders. And we're going to maximize the amount of money that we can offset the COVID costs as well, because what we want to do is we want to free up as much of our general fund as possible. And for us, that's critical because we were like several counties in Eastern Kentucky, had a major flood that came along and really negatively impacted our community, along with the flash floods that came on 2 months later. And what that resulted in was now we had to go out to Kentucky Emergency Management to get emergency road funds and FEMA funds. And as any county judge or any magistrate will tell you, or an EMA director will tell you, funds coming from FEMA, funds coming from Kentucky Emergency Management can be very long-term funds. You're not going to get them immediately. Kentucky Emergency Management is actually much better than FEMA is. So what happens is we have to either put off these major repairs, making things, creating the possibility that a repair that was $75,000 now becomes $150,000, or we can go ahead and do the repair and then we have to eat that until we get reimbursed. Now, I'm one of those counties that Ms. Thomas described that that 1.485 million actually is greater than my tax base. So, that's just a reality that we have to deal with. So what we hope we've already done the report, and we actually contracted someone to help us manage the money to give us that extra set of eyes outside the local political scene, and to make sure that we spend it correctly so we don't have to come back later on and have to deal with it. Have any questions if anybody wants to ask them?
So your total pot of money was only a little over 1 million. Is that what you said?
1.4. When was that?
I thought what Ms. Thomas had said that every county got 10 million.
No. That's that if you got more than 10 million, it's a whole different. Yeah, we only got 1.485.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What I had said was that that's the maximum amount. And so the amount that they could spend, and I'm sorry, I was not clear on that. Thank you for asking that. The up to 10 million, but they could spend either up to their entire allocation, which for a lot of Kentucky counties is much smaller than 10 million or 10 million. So.
Okay.
So, Judge, have you had a lot of public input, Judge, on how folks think the money should be spent?
Well, not a whole lot, and I primarily I think that's because the rules until January 6th were kind of restrictive, and it was really difficult to figure out. It's it's less, though it's complex now, it's much less complex than it was before January 6th.
Okay, and can you give me an idea of what they are suggesting?
Well, we didn't get any suggestions.
Oh, okay.
And that's because people couldn't understand what came, because somebody said, if somebody said, I want you to put a culvert in on my driveway, I'm going to go by Kentucky Revised Statute saying I can't do that. And then, some other things pop up. And again, like I said earlier, and this is me, remember, the judges get together about 3 times a year, and all of us are absolutely paying attention to the fact that the infrastructure money is coming down the pipe. And I think we're all waiting to see what that comes. But the biggest problem that we have, especially when we're dealing with the federal government, and most of us deal with federal government via natural resources or FEMA, until you have that money in your hand, you've got to deal with what's right in front of you, because there's no guarantee you're going to get it in under 5 years. I am literally still trying to get FEMA money from 2015.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna throw my hand up, but I want to make sure that there's no one else because I've already asked a question. So if I'm good to go, I'm just going to go for it. So I think you brought up a really great point, which is the language can be very confusing. So even for someone who works at an organizational level or as an advocate, do you have any ideas or suggestions for how to make this information more digestible to the general public? Or do you suggest trying to do that?
Well, in my experience, if you can put it in terms of how it impacts the individuals, that helps them understand it. Unfortunately, it gets very, like if I sit there and say, like the kind of way I'm approaching it is I'm going to try to put as much money as I can into my emergency management response and covering COVID expenses so that I can keep that much money in the general fund. People understand that I have control of the general fund as the fiscal court. So that means I don't have to worry about restrictions if I keep that money in the general fund. And then I can sit there and say things like, all right, I have enough money now to blacktop a road, but I think because, again, I'm waiting for infrastructure money like every other judge is. We're hoping that we're going to get this big windfall in that as well. But let's say I sit there and say, okay, what we can now do is we now can help somebody with a $5,000 program to develop their local business. Or I can now do a graveyard road that I couldn't do normally, as long as the fiscal court supports it. Those are the kind of things that we can now do, which people understand. But again, it just basically comes down to, it's not real easy to explain because people don't understand the nuances of, and it's just because they haven't had the time to sit down and read it. They don't understand the nuances of just because I've got $1 million doesn't mean I have $1 million I can spend on anything.
And if I can chime in there too, the interesting thing about this ARPA money is that it allows for and encourages expenditures for a lot of things that you normally wouldn't think of government spending money on, specifically related to COVID. And so I think, and Judge, you can probably weigh in on this too. It's just not something that people that are on fiscal courts or that are county judges are even used to thinking about spending money on, because it's not stuff like, as you noted, under the Kentucky Revised Statutes that you could usually do, or under federal law. So it's kind of new for everybody. And I think that's one of the areas that makes it pretty exciting. People are going to tend to lapse into the patterns that they think about all the time. Like we do roads, we do EMT, we do police, we do jail, we do, and so getting folks to deviate away from that is going to be difficult because it's just so different than it's ever been before. So I think that that's both a challenge, but it's also an opportunity.
Oh, it's an incredible opportunity. And what's really challenging about it sometimes is this influx of money is going to help us as a community overcome some long-standing deficiencies we've had. But you, at the same time, you would love to sit there and say, okay, I want to sit there and take $10,000 and give it to somebody doing a startup business or help somebody come back. Now, in my community, we happen to be very lucky because I'd say 99% of our businesses were critical. In other words, they didn't have to shut down. We had a couple of beauty shops and a barber shop, but other than that, people were able to pretty much stay open. So, I mean, that's a blessing for us. But one of the biggest issues that I have to deal with when I talk to people is I've had people say, well, listen, we want to build a new justice center. We want to build a new search and rescue building. And I'm like, okay, listen, whatever money, this is nice money to have, but it's not going to be here in 2 years. So we don't want to add infrastructure that's going to cost us more money to maintain it, after the money's gone. Because right now I have a population of about 7,300 people overall. I have a tax base of about 3,400. So the reality is adding more, I've got buildings sitting empty right now. So adding infrastructure is just adding cost to the taxpayers. And currently, though it's changing, a lot of my taxpayers are senior citizens, retirees who are on fixed incomes. And so but we're blessed, like a lot of Eastern Kentucky, we're seeing the turnaround that the people are starting to come in here instead of everything getting drained away from us. So I see some real positive future potential here, but what we can't do is add a huge amount of infrastructure that's going to cost us a lot of money until that group of people gets here.
We've had 2 more questions come into the chat, and Chuck and Pam, you all can think about how to maybe tag team responses. But the first one is, can counties come together to pool ARPA money for a project in their region, so a multi-county project? And then Greg Legs was interested in best practices for community organizations to request consideration for funding.
Well, I think some counties are coming together. I mean, we aren't pooling the ARPA money, but what we're doing is we're pooling resources. We routinely sit down and talk about how can we share blacktopping equipment? Can we share blacktopping material? Can my trucks haul it for you guys so you don't have to contract to make it not a cash flow issue? I think one of the things we're seeing more and more of, at least here in Eastern Kentucky, I'm not sure about other places, that we're starting to see more interagency agreements here, intercommunity agreements, so that we can pool resources instead of eliminating the governments. What we're trying to do is we're trying to cut down on the number of resources that are overlapping. And I think we're moving in a positive direction. I can say in the last 3 years, I've seen significant movement by a significant number of fiscal courts that have sat there and said, okay, we can't do it by ourselves. We have to start pooling our resources.
And I think that's especially true in Eastern Kentucky because their property tax bases are declining. And with that being the largest resource for them, pooling resources has become just instrumental, I think, with keeping things going. As far as the question about best practices for community organizations, I think that the best approach for you to do is to reach out to your county judges and your magistrates and find out what their process is going to be. And if they haven't really thought about it or they don't really know, because again, this is overwhelming for everybody, honestly. Suggest something for them. Suggest, helping organize or coordinate or doing some community meetings or some other things. Help them out. None of them have this job as a full-time job. Most of them have other jobs too. And like you all are volunteers, it's kind of everybody working together. So, offer to help to do those things if they haven't thought about them. Don't just assume that they're not going to do them. But, kind of be proactive in it and encourage them to do it and all of that. And somebody had also asked, when are they going to get the second tranche of money? The counties and the larger cities, it's probably going to be sometime between April and June, and the smaller cities is probably going to be closer to July by the time those allocations get to, they go to DLG first in Kentucky, the Department for Local Government, and then they get distributed out from there. So, but I really do think it's important to, to make your voices heard, and also to encourage people to be creative and to be creative yourselves within all of this. And don't be afraid. Somebody could tell you no, but that's okay. You don't know.
Yeah, I agree with absolutely what Ms. Thomas said. And let me just share something from somebody who is from the county government perspective. One thing we have a lot of is people telling us what we should be doing. What we don't have a lot of is people who come up with a plan and then come in and say, hey, we'll help you do this. And let me just tell you, a sense of humor is critical to doing that. Because remember, you're overcoming inertia. Most people will tell you, I move way too fast for most people in my community. But to overcome that inertia, you just got to keep coming in. You got to keep smiling. You got to keep joking. You got to take your licking and keep on ticking. All right. And that's, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, that's the first thing what I have done more times than I can count is I've given everybody an opportunity to run away. And that's what has happened. I mean, I had huge outcry over the fact that we went up and we cleaned a hiking trail, but because they used a mowing machine, it kind of ripped up the branches. Everybody got mad. So I said, okay, tell me how you want to fix it. This one young lady came, beautiful plan. I mean, drawn up, looked great. So she'd get people to do it. Well, now once a month, I say, you got the people to work on it? And now she doesn't take my calls anymore. All right. And the thing is, I understand people being upset. But if you really want to make change, trust me, the county government wants you to get involved, but you have to be involved. You can't just complain and walk away and say, you actually got to carry the load. And what you'll find is you'll make friends with these folks. Now in my small community, we're friends until you get in politics and everybody says, well, you're not doing anything for me. All right. Well, that's not always true, but the reality is once you get elected, people have different expectations of you. But you can contribute, you can make a difference, and if you keep attending the meetings, if you stay actively involved and keep pushing the envelope, you'll find that you can make a difference, and people will accept you and they will support you.
Knowing Chuck for a long time, I can tell you from experience, Chuck is not afraid to ask for anything and know it's not bothering him at all. Although I try not to say no to him, but he asks me a lot of stuff.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you both, Chuck and Pam. This has been great. I think there's been a lot of answers to questions that have been lingering. I so appreciate your approach to this, Chuck. It's one of the reasons that I reached out to you when we started talking about these ARPA funds. I do want